In this video, we're going to look at some of the biological risk factors of depression. And as a refresher, this is kind of the extension of the last video I made, which is called Depression Isn't Caused by a Chemical Imbalance in the Brain, Why This is a Myth. And you can watch that video by clicking on the top right-hand corner here, because in this video, I'm going to need us all to be on the same page that yes, we understand now that depression isn't caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. The next question that would follow suit is, what then causes depression? Of course, for a condition as complex as depression, we don't have the exact methodology to figure out any one cause, nor is that even the right question to be asking. But what we do have is a paradigm called the biopsychosocial model, which has been widely accepted by mental health professionals and researchers in this field. It helps us distill the complexity that is depression, and it helps us look at some of the risk factors that put a person at risk of developing depression. Before we begin, I want to share with you a comment that was left on my last video, and this is a comment from Joey Horvitz, aka subscriber 301, as he likes to call himself. Just want to read that to you verbatim. The current approach to treating psychiatric disorders will soon look ridiculous when they realize that there's more to it than suppressing symptoms. Hacking at the roots of these disorders is the only way to get permanent and life-changing results, unveiling past traumas, bringing them to the surface, and not masking. And it's in the spirit of this that I want to dedicate some time really looking at some of the risk factors of depression, so that we can walk away not knowing all the answers, but getting a little bit closer to having the answers that we need. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, because I make videos like this at least once a week. And also, I'm not a medical professional or a scientist, I'm a content creator, and I do put a lot of research into my videos. That said, let's begin with the first biological risk factor of depression, that is prescription medications. It's unclear what the exact link between certain prescription meds and the onset of depression symptoms is, but according to a 2018 study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, over a third of the US population is on a prescription drug in which depression is listed as a potential side effect. Some of these drugs include beta blockers, corticosteroids, benzodiazepines, and birth control, drugs that affect our hormones. What's interesting is that this finding is congruent with the growing awareness within the medical community and the general public that there really isn't that much of a distinction between the mind and the body on a biological level. They're not distinct entities. What affects the mind affects the body, and what affects the body affects the mind, which is a nice segue into our second point. Chronic inflammation. As a refresher about what inflammation is, when we get sick or injured, our body triggers inflammation as a natural response to the invaders in our body, aka viruses or bacteria. During this process, our white blood cells travel to the site of infection to prevent us from becoming further infected. When we get sick, we also tend to become more fatigued, more socially withdrawn, and have a loss of appetite. Do these symptoms ring a bell to you? To me, these are the symptoms of depression. Evolutionarily speaking, inflammation is adaptive, aka advantageous to the survival of our species. When we sleep, we heal. When we isolate ourselves from our peers, we prevent spreading our illnesses to them. And that's great and all when we have the cold or flu or coronavirus. But what happens when you move from acute inflammation to chronic inflammation? What happens when your body thinks that it's constantly being under attack? This is the case for people who have autoimmune disorders like rheumatoid arthritis, MS, lupus, type 1 diabetes. And it's also the case for people who are exposed to certain irritants for an extended period of time, such as industrial chemicals or air pollution. But also get this, there is a growing body of evidence that suggests that chronic stress can also lead to chronic inflammation. And I'm gonna leave that for our next video, where we talk about the psychological risk factors of depression. But in the meantime, if you are interested in learning more about the link between chronic inflammation and depression, I would highly recommend the book The Inflamed Mind by Edward Bullmore, who is a professor of psychiatry at the University of Cambridge. The third biological risk factor of depression is genetics. genes. You've heard that depression can often run in families, and research has shown that depression can be heritable. For example, one study showed that when one identical twin is depressed, the odds of the other twin becoming depressed or developing depression over the course of their lifetime is 76%. To date, the exact depression gene hasn't been identified, but there are a number of theories circulating about what specific traits we might have that make us more prone to depression. For example, we know that the trait of sensory sensitivity has a genetic component to it. And while highly sensitive people, aka HSPs, tend to be more intuitive and have a greater capacity for emotional empathy, if they, and when I say they, I mean we, because I count myself as one, if we're not equipped with the adequate coping mechanisms and support networks, we also run the risk of burning out and becoming depressed. Here's something else that's interesting that I want to share with you. In his book, Lost Connections, the author Johann Hari puts genetics' role in depression into the following perspective. Height is 90% determined by your genes. Language is 0% determined by your genes. Depression is 37% determined by your genes. And when I read that, my initial thought was 37% still seems like an awfully high number. But if you think about it, you know that certain conditions like diabetes, heart disease, these conditions run in families. But just because your family has a history of diabetes, for example, doesn't mean you are 100% doomed to a fate of diabetes. It might mean that you'll have to make certain lifestyle choices to sort of lower your risk of developing that condition. And it might mean that your lifestyle choices are are different from your chain smoking neighbor next door who's 120 years old. But the point is, genetics don't determine our destiny. And that is all I have to say about that. So now we have concluded this video. Those were 3 biological risk factors for depression. In my next video, I want to talk about the psychological risk factors for depression. And I want to thank you guys so much for being with me in this video. It's not exactly the lightest of topics to talk about, but I think that these conversations we're having and the topics that we're addressing are important, especially now. I think I read somewhere that 44% of Americans are without a job. And based on my statistics, I'm getting the impression that this is a very turbulent time for a lot of people, to say the least.